Hello, everyone. Welcome to this bonus edition of Chatting with the Lightkeeper. This episode is not a replacement for the weekly um, educational content. I guess you could say that my podcast, or at least I strive to provide with the podcast, but it is an opportunity for me to take my own advice and to share it with you. So, last week we chatted about erotic literature, erotica, and the difference between them, and a little bit about how it has impacted the lifestyle. And as part of that, I shared a couple of my bits of erotica that I had written. I shared them over on my blog and on FetLife. And lo and behold, uh, a stranger to me, but a person that is I've exchanged a few notes with over on FetLife said, well, hey, you talk about stepping out of your comfort zone. You should take the opportunity and read one of those two bits of erotica and put it out on a podcast. And I thought about it and I'm like, no, I can't do that. I mean, I blush when in person when talking to somebody and I say the word blowjob most of the time, even if it's talking with the guys. So, yes, doing something like this is very much out of my comfort zone. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I talk about stepping out of comfort zones all the time. And for me to read something like this to you would definitely be out of my comfort zone. So, with that in mind, I thought, you know what? I am going to take the challenge and I am going to share with you one of my bits of erotica. I'm going to read it to you. Now, please bear in mind, this is my first time ever doing something like this. So if you are expecting like audiobook quality, that's definitely not going to happen. I will get tongue-tied, I will stumble, and so please be prepared for my imperfections, and I hope you will forgive me in advance for them. But I think it's important that, I do practice what I preach. So, with that said, sort of the bonus edition disclaimer, let's get down to business. The title of the story is called The Princess and the Peasant, and so, without further ado, I will now get into the story. The beautiful daughter of a wealthy nobleman, Tatiana, was making her way to the village to shop for her family's daily needs. As she passed through the protective walls that kept the village safe from attack, she caught the eye of a handsome peasant, Ignat, that she longed to be with. Now, Ignat and his family are known for raising the best horses in the kingdom. However, he is not of a high enough standing for the well-bred Tatiana. Most nights she lay awake in her family's castle, dreaming of being with him, but there's gossip around the castle that has labeled him and his family low-life deviants. Many of her father's advisors and, of course, their gossiping wives have long told stories about his family's ways. It is rumored that Ignat's father has treated his wife as though she was a slave, and there are rumors of beatings and floggings and regular sources of gossip and speculation. Tatiana couldn't believe her ears, since whenever she saw Ignat's father and mother out in public, they appeared to be the most loving couple, and even as though they were older in years, their passion and love for each other could be seen by a blind man. Tatiana had allowed her fantasies to go to some very dark places that both excited her in ways she could never imagine, as well as scaring her. Through many dark nights in her room in the castle, she allowed her mind to have impure thoughts. Not only did she touch herself with desire to feel Ignat please her as a husband would please their wife, but her mind also longed for the passion and love she saw in his parents. Fantasies quickly were filled with Ignat's hands, spanking her like a child, and his horsewhip placing blow upon her pale skin. She came to realize that pain was something she craved, not as a punishment, but somehow her mind taught her that pain would free her mind from the daily worries that consume and overwhelm her at times. As Tatiana was frozen with fear as Ignat appeared to be walking towards her, she was suddenly jolted back to reality as an icy hand cruelly gripped her arm. Without needing to turn, she already knew the hand belonged to her father's third bride. Her father's current wife, Laura, was just 1 year older than her and had treated Tatiana as a threat to her father's affection. Laura's grip on Tatiana's arm forced her to wheel and face Laura's cold stare. As Laura told Tatiana, "You are in love with that nasty, worthless peasant boy. If you soil yourself with him, I will have you cursed so that no man worthy of your station will have you for his wife." Following that, Laura gave Tatiana a shove that sent her towards the gutter, and quickly she found herself on the ground, laying in the middle of the muddy, dung-filled gutter. As Tatiana slowly began to pick herself up from the gutter and watched Laura walk away with her brash walk, Ignat appeared and offered his hand to help her up. Tatiana refused his hand as she did not wish to soil him with the filth of the gutter that had contaminated her from head to toe. Ignat was not deterred by her refusal and reached down with his right arm, grabbed her flowing red hair in his hand, and pulled it up until it brought her to her feet. As she attempted to keep her legs under herself, because of the pain of being dragged to her feet by her hair, she also found herself weak with desire. Once standing, Ignat did not release her hair from his hand, and he began to pull her forward with it. Tatiana wanted to scream for help, to ask him where she was being taken, but her voice was gone. She could command her body to speak, but all that would happen is her mouth would open and no sound could be willed or coaxed out. Ignat led the filth-covered Tatiana off the main street into a dark, damp alley that was not covered with cobblestone but was slick with soft, muddy soil. A few paces down the alley, Ignat tossed Tatiana into a stable that is well known for its grooming of the nobleman's horses. As Tatiana was crudely tossed into the stable area, her legs were already wobbling from lust. She fell into a stall, landing softly in the hay. Before Tatiana could stand, she felt Ignat's hands once again pulling her to her feet by her hair, but instead of pulling her up this time, his hands guided her to a kneeling position in front of him. Ignat now spoke to her. "Tatiana, I love you, but you know your father will never allow us to be together. So now that I have my chance, I am going to take you and show you how it would feel to be loved by this humble peasant." Ignat reached into his pocket and removed his silver-handled dagger and began moving towards her with it. Tatiana recoiled with fear as she attempted to get to her feet to escape. He effortlessly pushed her back down again, and she found herself laying in the hay looking up at his handsome face. His face was flushed with desire, and her fears were replaced with thoughts that she finally had what she had longed for. Her hope Her mind told her that he was right. Her father would never allow them to be together, and she decided that at that moment she would show him that she indeed could be the woman that she knew filled his fantasies. Ignat's dagger began tearing at the bottom of her skirt, and its sharpness shredded the fine silken fabric in her clothes with ease. As the layers of her noble clothing were peeled away, she could feel the sharpened metal of the blade gently pushing against her skin as he cut away the last of her undergarments. Without asking, without waiting for him to ask, she stood before him and removed the last of her sliced garments. Although taught to behave like a lady, she was filled with desire, and standing before him naked, she watched him look at her, and her body trembled in anticipation of his touch. While she watched, he began to disrobe, and as he slipped out of his worn, faded pants, she found herself staring at his manhood. He smiled slyly as he followed her gaze to his throbbing and enlarging penis. He again stepped forward and took her in a powerful embrace. As they embraced, he once again knotted her hair in his hand and guided her lips to his. Passionate kisses only fueled his manhood's desire, and she felt it grow and harden against her warm skin. Tatiana not only could feel his desires pressing against her, but she also could feel her arousal beginning to leak out and moisten her thighs. Tatiana was lost in his lustful kisses, but Ignat's grip on her hair was pushing her down upon her knees. As soon as she was kneeling in the hay, he spoke to her with a command that intoxicated her. Sin shall set you free, he said. She knew what he wanted, as the church bishop had warned against the sin of taking a man inside one's mouth. Feeling as though she had been set free, and being able to love the man she wanted but never would be allowed to be with, she opened her mouth and began sliding his erect cock in and out of her mouth. With every trip up and down his shaft, she could feel his body tremble and his breath quicken. His hands were gently caressing her head and her hair as she adjusted her rhythm to match his quickening thrust between her lips. Her joy and pleasure that she was taking from carnal desires was fulfilling him, er, ah, excuse me there. Her joy and the pleasure she was taking from carnal desires she was fulfilling for him made her feel the happiest she could remember. Suddenly, she felt his hands both grabbing and pulling her hair. Ignat held her hair in such a way that her head felt like it was locked in the stocks in the village square. He was thrusting himself deeper, harder into her mouth than she allowed him before. Soon she could feel herself unable to control her throat, and she could hear as well as feel the gagging noises his cock was causing. He would thrust himself into her throat, and he would hold that position for what seemed like an eternity, and all the while her body tried to recoil from him. Her breath was hard to catch as she gagged, and just when she thought she couldn't take it one more second, he would pull back out of her mouth. She was horrified but mesmerized to see the long strands of saliva from her mouth to the tip of his cock as he would pull it out of her mouth. Just as she was finding she was enjoying the pleasures of his manhood tickling her throat, he stepped back from her and guided her to her feet. He pulled some rope from the side of the stall and bound her hands tightly, almost too tightly with it. Ignat then took the rope, looped it over the rough sawn beams overhead, pulling the rope so that she was forced to stand on her toes with her back facing him. Not sure what he was doing, her mind was racing and trying in vain to justify the sin she had chosen to commit. Just when she was about to ask him to release her, she felt the intense pain of a riding crop impact her bottom, and he had not started with a soft blow. The pain sizzled, and she was shocked to have her body screaming for more. Quickly, blow after blow impacted the back of her legs and her ass. As the pain raced through her body, her mind turned blank. The only thoughts she could muster were the intense longing for more pain and the desire to do whatever pleased him. As suddenly as the impacts began, they ended, and with a loud hiss she felt as well as heard the rope loosen. Tatiana fell forward as the rope was released from its mooring and caught herself bent in half against the back of the stall with the tension of the rope gone. Before she could stand up, she felt his strong hands on her hips, holding her bent over. His manhood was pressing against the lips of her pussy, and she shifted her body naturally to allow him to enter her. Rather than roughly force his way inside her, Tatiana admired the way Ignat gently slipped himself in. He slowly moved in and out of her pussy, and soon she was rewarded with being able to feel his pelvic bone push up against her cheeks, telling her that his thrust was as deep as it could go. Ignat's greedy yet rhythmic thrust had Tatiana's insides trembling and feeling like they were part of the minstrels that entertained at the court. Her body began to shake uncontrollably, and just as she was orgasming, she felt Ignat push as deeply as he could inside her and hold himself there so she would come all over his cock. As Tatiana's orgasm was leaving her body, Ignat spoke again. I will make you mine in sin, and I have not finished sinning with you yet. And with that, she felt his hands push her ass cheeks apart, and she trembled as she felt his warm, wet cock press it against her asshole. It was so well covered in her juices that it was easy for him to slip the head inside her. The tearing and searing pain that his intrusion had caused just increased her desire to please him. He slowly and carefully worked himself in a little deeper with each soft yet demanding thrust. Tatiana worried that she would not be able to engulf him the way she had with her pussy, but the pain mixed with pleasure relaxed her, and she found that his thrust had quickened and deepened. Suddenly she was rewarded when a moan escaped her lips, his body quaked, and she felt him filling her with his seed. Ignat's orgasm was so powerful that he nearly fell as he trembled and shook with his release. As he withdrew from his love, he told Tatiana, the world may not let us be together, but through sin we can share everything. Tatiana replied, it can't be sin if it feels so right. They fell into each other's arms, and into the hay they drifted off into a pleasant state of bliss. Suddenly the sound of horseshoes clomping up the ground roused them from their blissful embrace. Ignat quickly tossed Tatiana some old worn clothes and suggested she hurry to the seamstress, as it's much later in the afternoon now. He had assured her that Laura would not take note of the new clothes as she had pushed her into the gutter earlier. Ignat then took a moment to tell her that he had family who lived in the next kingdom just to the north as woodsmen, and there they could be together. He told her that he would pack food for them, have a horse for her and him, and would to Tatiana agree to meet him outside the castle at midnight. She agreed to meet him at midnight and escape together so they could be together, as she hurriedly dressed in the peasant garb and raced out of the stable to the dressmaker's shop. Tatiana hurried up the cobblestone street and was surprised to feel so full of joy. She had not the slightest regrets after giving in to the peasant's sinfulness. As she walked with a brisk pace, she could feel Ignat's seed dripping out and found it strangely arousing, and she craved more of it. As she reached the shop, she tried one last time to make herself look presentable and entered the cold, dark building. Tatiana swung the heavy wooden door shut behind her and began to walk forward to see old Miss Yaga. As soon as she was about to say hello, the old woman looked at her and said, "Lara, indeed she has disgraced your family." Tatiana turned and found Lara moving toward the only exit with the old lady standing before her holding a cup of steamy liquid. "Tatiana, you have humiliated your father today, but I want to protect you in your father's name. I have asked Miss Yaga to help, and she has agreed to help us. She has prepared a spell that will cause you to forget everything you did today. That way your father can find a suitable match, and you can enter into it with all the innocence that is expected of a lady. You have but 10 seconds to decide to leave, and I will tell your father of your sins today, or you can drink and save your father from heartbreak. Your time starts now," Laura explained coldly. Torn between the love of her father and the love of a man society will never allow her to be with, Tatiana picked up the cup and drank the warm potion. Tatiana had no other way to explain it other than as soon as she drank the potion and it started flowing into her, she felt as though she was old. Lara and Miss Yaga shared a hearty laugh and both pointed at Tatiana as their laughter filled the air. Tatiana glanced in the mirror and saw only a grizzled old woman in it. She tentatively touched her body and realized that indeed she was the old woman. She fled from the shop as fast as she could, running for the castle, running for home. Even though she still felt like a young woman, her legs worked at the speed of an old lady. Lara's carriage sped by and was quickly out of sight. When Tatiana finally reached the gates of the castle, the guards, all known to her from childhood, refused her entry. She pleaded with the guards, trying to explain who she was, but as she tried to explain, the memories of who she was started to fade. Suddenly she was no more than a distant memory, even to herself. Not knowing where to go or even how to get there, she wandered away from the kingdom. She was drawn to the north, but had no idea why. As she wandered from the kingdom, she found herself taking odd jobs and doing chores just to eat. She found few men interested in her in this rough country, and those that were interested simply used and discarded her. Tatiana found employment working as a teamster for a small logging camp. The men there didn't want her doing a man's job, but they had been short-handed for too long, so they agreed to take her on, but for only half the wages since she was a woman. Soon summer had faded to winter, and the work continued despite the snow and the cold. One day a new man arrived in camp. Tatiana didn't recognize him, and he seemed disgusted to find a woman doing a man's job. The head of the logging crew informed Tatiana that a family member had arrived from the kingdom of the south, and she would be replaced in the morning. The family member was taking her job. That evening she was too upset to join the rest of the loggers for dinner, and she retired to her small shack to pack her meager belongings. Tatiana was woken from her slumber by the sound of a winter's wind blowing through her tiny abode. The wind chilled her to the bone as she noticed the flimsy door had opened. She assumed the howling wind had blown it open, and as she turned to return to bed after closing the door, a lantern was slowly turned up. The brightening light revealed the figure of a man sitting in the lone chair in the one-room shack. The man in the chair was the new man in camp, the one taking away her job at the one place that had shown any kindness to her. She wanted to yell at him in rage, but fear kept her from yelling. She feared he had come to use her before being discarded. Why not, she figured. All the other men along the way had used and thrown her away. At least here she knew she wouldn't fake feelings, and strangely she could handle that. The man just looked at her and stared. He didn't speak. He just kept staring. Finally Tatiana had enough and stripped off her clothes and said, "There. Is this better to look at? Come have your way with me and let's get this over with." The man just smiled, and Tatiana felt something warm inside her, a feeling she had not felt before, or had she? Something seemed safe and almost familiar about this man, but she could not remember him. He was far too young, and young men were never kind to an old lady such as herself. The man approached her holding a small length of rope, and since she had resigned herself to the fate of being used again, she held out her hands for him to bind. Once her hands were bound, he used her shirt sleeves as a crude blindfold and fastened it over her eyes. Tatiana now feared for her safety, but she knew if the strange man was family, her screams would be of no help. Tatiana was pushed face down over the end of her crude bed, and as she feared, soon she felt the warmth and hardness of a man trying to push inside her. This man was different, she noticed. He hadn't just jammed it in her dry pussy. He was taking his time and massaging his clit, or her clit, with his hardness, and as much as she tried to fight it, she could feel herself growing moist. Just as she felt he would push inside her, he felt him step back, and there was a silence in the room. The silence was broken by the crack of a horsewhip. Tatiana felt the pain of the impact, but also heard a sound that didn't fit. It was as if the whip lashed out against her skin. She swore not only she could feel the pain, but she could also hear what sounded like the cracking of 1,000 eggs. The flogging seemed to go on for a very long time, but when it stopped, she felt a hand exploring her pussy. The pain had made her moist even though she couldn't explain it. He now knew she was ready, and she felt him begin to press himself inside her. He was gentle and yet demanding in his entrance. The deeper he moved inside her, the more alive Tatiana felt, and soon she could feel he was thrusting as deep as he could, and as his thrust picked up speed, she could still hear what sounded like the cracking of eggs. With every thrust slammed deep inside her, all she could hear was a crackling noise. Soon she began to feel warm, and the sheets balled in her hands suddenly felt softer and not as coarse. Suddenly her mind was awash in memories. It was like as though she had woken from a coma. Her mind swirled with the thoughts of Ignat, her father, Lara, the castle, the old witch. All the while she could feel this man pumping her harder and deeper and so forcefully. As much as she wanted him to stop, to be left alone and to think, he was not going to stop. Her pleas could not escape her lips. All she could do was moan, and then out of nowhere her body began to tremble, and she felt it approaching like a huge wave creeping up on an unsuspecting swimmer at the beach. The orgasm shook her, and she tried in vain to push him out of her. Unfortunately, he was too near his release, and he fought to stay buried inside her. As soon as they had both released their orgasm, she felt him help her to her feet, unbind her hands, and then unfasten the crude blindfold. Standing before her was Ignat, and she remembered him. She remembered everything. The emotions were too much. She found herself falling into his arms. Ignat caught her and guided her into bed, and then explained what happened. At midnight he had been waiting outside the castle, just like he had said, but rather than Tatiana, it was Lara who appeared at midnight. Lara explained that Tatiana had been disposed of thanks to the witch's spell. Ignat knew of just one witch in the kingdom, so he confronted Miss Yaga and threatened her with his dagger. She confessed to the spell and told Ignat that the only way to break it was for the same lover and impurity to find her again. But he would never be able to find her as she no longer knew herself. Ignat then went wandering the kingdom searching for Tatiana but could never find her. So in vain he left to join his family and work in the woods. When he arrived at the one when he arrived and learned that a wandering woman named Tatiana worked at the camp, and one glance at her eyes told him it was indeed the Tatiana of his dreams. So he arranged to repeat the original sin as best he could and hope for the best. Tatiana learned that her father had also arranged to knight anyone who found his missing daughter, and thus it would allow her and Ignat to live happily ever after. So that is the story, and I appreciate you giving it a listen and allowing me to push outside of my comfort zones and to share it with you. So um, on that note, I hope that you were not disappointed in both the story and my telling of the story. Yes, absolutely. I know I could do better. But for our first time, I'll take it. And perhaps we can do something like this again sometime. So I want to thank you again for listening. And no matter where you're listening, please go ahead and click the follow button so you never miss an episode. And I look forward to chatting with you at a regularly scheduled episode that will drop on Tuesday. So until then, have a wonderful day, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.